Welcome, everybody. All right, today we're talking about parenting from a boy to a man. Boys learn at a very young age from their parents and others around them about expected behaviors based on their gender. And these societal norms are described as masculine ideologies. And masculinity ideology refers to the traditional, socially constructed definitions about the cultural norms and the expectations regarding male behavior. And for decades, the dominant cultural image of masculinity has included heterosexuality, physical strength, athleticism, control over situations, family caretaking as the head of the household, financial success, and or not crying or showing emotion. And these messages are often conveyed from cartoons and movies and verbalized by parents. So we have to wonder, what is this traditional masculine ideology? Well, some of those things are: men are the breadwinner and responsible head of the household. Males are anti-feminine, which includes concealing their emotions. Heterosexuality is the normative sexual orientation. Males are expected to have a high status and confidence. Men are violently tough and physically strong. These are ideologies. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates that males' endorsement of certain masculine ideologies are associated with a range of problems. And you might expect that boys and men who identify as gay or bisexual may be at a heightened risk for psychological difficulties. For example, there's a study among adolescents reported that gay and bisexual youth constantly struggle with navigating being authentically male while accepting their sexual orientation. These are great challenges in this wokey day and age that we live in. And it's a real challenge. And I can tell you, as a parent of a boy at 12 years old, it's a real challenge raising this kid with these influences around them. I live in Seattle. Seattle is a city filled with wokey, crazy, liberal, psychotic people. And in our school system, which is run by the unions, and 80% of our tax dollars, our home taxes, are paid to our schools. And what did they hire? A bunch of blue hair, woke, LGBTQ, transvesties that want to tell our kids how to be a transvestite. They just want to desperately convert our children into this wokey strategy. And it's so bad that in the most expensive city in America to raise children, you have to also pay for private school because of the psychological damage that these wokey crazies try to instill in our boys, in our children, and all the stupid books that they force down their throat, and all their transvestite, story time hours, and it's just nuts. It's crazy, and it's sick. And then they got the boys, dressed as girls and acting as girls, competing in girls' sports. This is psychotic, but this is the day and age we live in, and they want you to believe that it's perfectly normal. The truth is, gender identity is still a psychological issue in the DSM-5. What we have to understand is there's some common types of masculine traits among boys and men. Number one is the strong and silent. Being viewed as unemotional is central to the strong and silent masculine script. Enacting the script helps the boys and men live up to masculine role expectations through stoic and in control of your feelings. Then there's this tough guy, closely related to the strong and silent masculine gender role script are those messages associated with being a tough guy. For example, when boys learn to be tough, they too frequently do so by suppressing emotions potentially associated with vulnerability. Other tough guy messages that relate to presenting issues include prescriptions that men must be aggressive, fearless, and invulnerable. And then there's this idea of a playboy. Boys often learn to suppress to the extent in which they allow themselves to care for and connect with others. And this suppression may lead to non relational sex, which is a tendency to experience sex primarily as lust without any requirements of relational intimacy or emotional attachment. Then there is the homophobic script that you're up against when you're parenting a boy to a man. Being traditionally masculine is to avoid any features associated with femininity or homosexuality. Therefore, characteristics that are potentially associated with homosexuality, like intimate connection with other men, must be avoided in yourself and disdained in others. And then there's this thing called a winner script. And it's extremely important masculine script in American culture that is being competitive and successful. And this includes characteristics like impatience, high drive for achievement, hostility, high need for control, competitiveness, inability or unwillingness to express yourself. And then there's rigid masculine socialization. These are strange little terms, but they're very important in the psychological world. Adhering to strict connotations of masculinity can have a negative impact on both health and mental health functioning in boys and men. And here's some problems with dating and interpersonal intimacy. That can happen if you're overly in a masculine posture. You know, greater depression and anxiety, abuse of substances, problems with interpersonal violence like sexual assault, sexual abuse, greater health risk, high blood pressure, greater overall psychological distress. These things come along when you teach the masculinity in a very rigid way. So you have to be very careful because today, in this day and age, what women tend to be looking more for is a sensitive man, but he's masculine. A masculine, sensitive man, which is very, very hard line to walk. So, as you're teaching a young boy how to be a man, it is very important to understand that you have to reflect on the day and age that we live in because you want your child, your son, to go out into the world and be able to pair up with a female in this day and age. But unfortunately, many people don't even know what gender they want to be. And it's very strange because in the teenage years, this ambiguity of sexuality is becoming more and more pervasive in our school systems, especially public school. And so, what we have to understand is these kids are questioning everything about their sexuality, and oftentimes are very confused as they move into their 20s. You know, so what we have to talk about is how to raise boys who can be true to themselves and who don't see violence and aggression as the only way to be a true man or dominance as the only way to lead. And more importantly, we want to raise boys who are not threatened when another boy wants to be their friend. And this is asking a lot. You know, we're asking them to be strong and sensitive, invincible and vulnerable. It's a paradox. And the paradox of raising a good man, in order to do this, we have to challenge them and support them and hold them accountable, but also give them unconditional love. And the first thing that we have to do is listen. Listening is a very, very powerful thing. First of all, the listener is the one in charge of the conversation. But being able to be a good listener with your child is very, very important ingredient as a father. That means you care about their words, you care about what they say, because if you are a good listener, you're going to have a bigger voice into your son's life. And really listening without judgment, it's very important. And it's the best way to communicate love and unconditional support. It's also one of the most powerful things a human being can do for another human being. So often parents want to rush in with a solution or suggestion without giving the child a chance to speak. So what's important is as a child is entering in the 10 to 14 years old period, as a father and as a parent, you really want to become a very good listener at that age because your child is going to go out into the world and start integrating. And to do that, you need to know your child well enough and know their thoughts well enough to help guide them. Because after all, your job is to get them to checkout time. That is your job, and you need to have them equipped to check out. And so that's an important ingredient. You're not endorsing any kind of position in this day and age. What you have to do is you have to affirm feelings. You have to be a good listener. You have to be curious about how someone feels. So if they ask a lot of questions, because what's important is what connects two human beings, and it's very important for a young boy to understand this, is feelings are important because feelings are where we are as human beings. That is our reality as a human being, is how we feel about everything in our life. And so when you understand another's feelings as a boy, that is a very powerful thing because that teaches you to be number one, respectful, number two, a good listener, and it also allows you to connect deeper with whoever you want to have in your life. Because if you communicate at the feeling level, you communicate at a level that people really need, not want. That means you're not talking about how was your day, who did you talk to, what did you do. You're talking about how do you feel about this, how do you feel about that, how do you feel about the movie, how do you feel about this girl, how do you feel about this guy, how do you feel about this teacher. These are very important conversations to have because they teach perspective, and that is what a boy needs to understand in this day and age. You want to stress their importance also. You want to teach your kids that feelings have a job to do. So when your son has a feeling, he needs to have an emotional understanding to discover what the feeling is telling him. It's the thing, it's really strange because as we get through the day and ages of the past, especially moving from the 50s, many people think of anger and happiness as emotions that boys will migrate to. Well, there are a lot of subtleties to things like anger. First of all, if you go higher, there's rage, but if you go lower, there's frustration, there's irritability, there's unhappiness, there's a sense of feeling overwhelmed. I mean, it's very important to understand that there's very subtle emotions underneath anger. You don't have to represent every emotion with the label of either angry or happy. That is not what you want your son to learn. You want them to learn the subtleties of their emotions so that they can learn how to manage their emotion. Sadness's job is to slow us down. It means something is bothering us, and it gives us the opportunity to reflect on what is bothering us and why. Anger's job is the opposite. It speeds us up. Anger tells us that our rights have been violated and helps us mobilize to protect against future threats. It also motivates us to make change when there's something about a situation that we don't like. You know, Anxiety is kind of like an alarm bell. And it tells us there might be something dangerous ahead, and it motivates us to prevent that thing from happening, to make a plan to solve a problem, even to run for safety. There's this other emotion called guilt. Yeah, I did something wrong, something a parent or a teacher will disapprove of. Guilt can help us to act according to our morals and values, but it reminds us that no one is perfect and that we always strive to be better. Also, you want to help your son understand that they do not have to live in guilt and shame. What they have to do is take accountability. And in this day and age, accountability is just not something our kids are learning from adults because the adults are not taking accountability. They literally gaslight everybody in this world around them to think that everybody else is crazy but them. And it's really sad because we live in a narcissistic culture, and narcissists love to teach their children that I am so smart and you're not. And they're terrible parents because they're egotistical pigs who really want everybody else to believe that everybody else is crazy and they're not. And so what they do is they raise codependent children. So guilt is a healthy emotion, but it's not emotion you want to live in. It's an emotion that says, hey, there's something in this world you need to take accountability for. And now your plan is to figure out how to take accountability. And that is what your son needs to understand, that feelings don't last forever. even the good ones. An emotion, the real word that it derives from is emote. And emote is like vapor going out the window, going out the screen. Emote is venting. And that's what emotions are meant to be. They're meant to be vented, they're meant to be expressed. But does that mean they have to have a call to action? No. And that's what boys need to understand because boys want to fix everything. And so to take away that fixed mentality is a very important ingredient. You want your son to be a good listener, understand that there are feelings, to be able to validate feelings, but you don't want them to believe that they own other people's feelings. The other people's feelings are not a call to action. And that's an important thing for a boy to understand. Just like the weather, feelings come and go. Once emotions can be recognized, labeled, we know the job that they're there to do, and we can help children manage them. And that is understanding when you're dealing with a boy the difference between reactivity and responsiveness. So, reactivity is when I make decisions while I'm emotional. We want to learn to get away from that. You need to learn because boys are very strong. Boys can be very powerful. Boys can be very dangerous. Boys can be very violent. So, what you want to learn is you want to teach a boy the deal about being responsive, which means you take the time to learn to respond rather than react. That means you let the emotion get vented, you let yourself get through the emotion before you make big decisions. This is a very important ingredient, but many boys don't understand that until they reach about 14 to 15 years old. So we have to continue to teach that. That is a critical tool of teaching a boy to be a man. You have to really make it okay to make mistakes and to fail. As a matter of fact, I would much rather a kid fail, especially a boy, fail while they're under your roof than fail when they're not. You want them to learn from their mistakes and you want to help them through the mistakes, but you want to also make mistakes an okay thing to have. Because if you start coming down on them when they make mistakes and make them feel stupid and make them feel wrong, you are not going to teach them to be resilient in this life. You're going to teach them to be insecure in this life, and they're going to have a really hard time when they get employed and they have some domineering boss that they're not going to have any resiliency. So what you have to understand is you want to teach them that it's okay to make mistakes. It's more important how you recover from the mistakes. And it's also important to take accountability. These are very important lessons for a boy. You want the best for your kid. You don't want your kid to fall behind. None of us do. That's a very important thing in this life. And so what we have to do is understand that it's much easier and takes less time, to teach. What's on the line for me if my child does not perform well? What if my child turns in homework with errors on it? What kind of parent would I be if I failed to play well or do or if they don't get good grades? You know, grades are not what you want to measure a kid on. Intellect is what you want your kid to measure that be measured on. And that means their curiosity to learn because that's called Socratic learning. And that's really the real education that we don't have in the United States. And that's why places like England do education so much better because they're Socratic. They're not based necessarily on the grade that you get. What they're based on is your curiosity and your desire to learn from other people and understand that you don't have all of the facts and all the truths, and other people look at things differently than you do. And that is called Socratic learning. That is where real intellect is formed. You also have to remember making a mistake does not mean you are a mistake. If you don't make mistakes, you don't make anything. Failure is how we learn. It's the scientific process. And that's what a boy needs to understand, that they do not have to be perfect. This is a very important ingredient because boys are competitive and they compare themselves to each other, just like girls do. But boys, if they feel that they're lower down in a pecking order, that's not a good thing. What you want them to understand is they are different and they have special talents on their own that is different than everybody else. And comparing yourself to everybody else is not a good idea. You also want to model emotional intelligence by talking about your feelings. Your kids are watching you. How do they see you express anger? How do they see you express sadness, disappointment? How do you express affection? Dads, you can really become more vulnerable yourself to admit that you're afraid and ask for help. This is an important thing because you want your son to have that resiliency in this life. That's a very important ingredient. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we're going to come right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about raising a boy to a man. Mr. Rogers said that the only solution to loneliness and fear is to share it with someone. We still want our boys to be competitive and to get to the top. We just don't want them to get there alone. We want them to learn how to be a participant. What is a participant? Well, if you think about a team, so if you're on a team, let's say you're the best batter or you're the best a defensive player, you are a part of a team, but you're not the whole team. And so what everybody's dependent on a team is that everybody is playing at their best level. That is what your contribution is to a team, and that is what boys want to learn in this life is how to be a participant and how to be a winner by understanding how to work together as a team and how to communicate as a team and how to lead a team. The world we live in today isn't the same as our grandfathers, our uncles, and even many of our fathers. We live in a time when skills like empathy, collaboration, good communication are necessary to succeed in school and in the workplace. But for the most part, we aren't teaching boys these skills at devastating cost to themselves and the rest of us. So what can we do to raise more positive, masculine boys? It's very important to understand that there's ingredients that you want to encourage, and the first one is encourage personal expression when it comes to introduce boys that how to treat a girl, how to respect, how to have manners. This is a very important thing, and they can practice on their mom. That's a very important thing. Or practice on their siblings if they have a sister. It's very important for a boy to learn how to respect a girl and how to put her first, how to open doors, how to say please, how to say thank you, how to hold your fork, how to eat properly. These are very important parts of socialization. These are also parts of attractiveness. A boy who has good manners has a better shot in their life of landing a very healthy girl. But a boy without manners is going to have a little bit of trouble socializing and making it through life. So manners play a huge role in a boy because you expect that somebody who's going to be very strong and very powerful also learn how to control it and have self-discipline because self-discipline is a factor in a boy's life and manners teach self-discipline. You also want to use play and imagination to define positive values. When role playing with toys and stuffed animals to imagery characters, use language that is emotionally expressive, compassionate, empathetic. For example, ask your son things like, are they sad? How do you know? How can we help? Highlight that being able to express a wide range of emotions, including being compassionate, in caring and collaborative, is a very positive for boys and girls. Empathy is not buying a problem. Empathy is like a police officer or a firefighter. You're showing up and you care, but you're not part of the problem. If I can help you, I would like to help you, but I'm here for you. I'm here to understand that you're struggling. That's the most important ingredient that a boy needs to understand is empathy rather than sympathy. Because people that sympathize, that is like sitting around listening to a whiner who will suck the soul straight out of your body. Whiners, all they want to do is whine, and all they want to do is complain and be a victim. You don't want to teach your son how to treat people as a victim. You want to teach them how to be resilient. That is what empathy is. Teaching empathy teaches resiliency. You also want to challenge stereotypes when it comes to clothing and accessories. One of the best ways to encourage boys to be their authentic selves is break free from gender stereotypes. Allow them to experiment with fashion self expression that isn't typically advertised to boys. Now, that may be color schemes, that may be types of clothing, and I'm not suggesting they're wearing their sister's dress or outfits. What I am suggesting is that they have the ability to experiment on what they like to wear and what they don't like to wear. But they also need to understand, as a boy, if you want them to adjust well into society and play a heterosexual role into their life and possibly have children, you want them to learn how to dress as a boy. You want them to know what the baseline of a boy looks like, what basic colors are, what basic clothing is, what kind of things that boys wear as men. These are very important things for them to understand as a guide. It doesn't mean that's how they're going to dress. They may go to school wearing leg warmers or some weird crap, but that doesn't mean that's what they're going to be every day of their life. What it means is they're experimenting, and that's okay. But knowing the baseline of how to dress so that they can adapt to society, we are social creatures, we are tribal animals. We need to learn how to dress well if we're going to be successful in this life. Remember, your job is not to sit around and be their best friend. Your job is to teach them how to make it in this life. That is your job. That's it. You're getting them to checkout time. So you want them to know what healthy looks like. Are they going to choose healthy? Maybe not. But you want them to know what healthy looks like so they can adjust well into this life. You also want to be clear about letting boys know that they must ask for permission to touch other people and that they have the right to say no if they don't want to be touched. These are very important lessons that they need to learn well before they're 10 years old. This is a very, respecting body space, especially in this day and age, can get, if they don't understand body space and if they don't understand touching, they also need to understand respectful language for people because you don't want them getting sexual harassment things at work. You don't want them getting in lawsuits. You don't want them going to jail for stupid reasons. You need them to understand that they need to have respect for other people's bodies, especially as boys. You also want to find books and TV shows and media that that have a good role. Read books and choose television shows and media that break free from gender norms, show boys and other male figures, as well as girls and women whose interests, their jobs, their emotional expressions challenge gender norms and model values of respect and equality. Good examples would be TV shows, like maybe like Ted Lasso is a very popular one that does a pretty good job of showing gender roles. This is a good thing. You also want to speak up when you hear disrespectful comments. When raising a boy, it's not you and the other family members who interact with your son, but they also, everybody has a large influence on your kid's life. So you want to be very careful as when you're raising your child, who is influencing your child. If grandparents, cousins, family, friends say something problematic, be sure to speak up in the moment and have a conversation about your values because you are trying to shape your child. And it's very important that they support that. And if they can't support that, if they're toxic, if there's some crazy transvestite like what they have running our school districts nowadays, that's probably not a good influence. But for some reason, these weirdos have made it into our education system so that they can infiltrate our children's lives. Identify positive role models. Role models in the family, in the community, in the media, in the entertainment, who model positive, healthy, respectful ways to be a boy. This could be someone who stays at home to support a female partner at work, someone who sticks up for their daughter's right to be whomever she wants to be, who has vulnerable, open conversations with their friends and their family. The other thing is to understand that other boys and girls may be making different decisions than they are. They may choose to be transvestites. They may choose to be transgender. They may support the wokey wokies. They may support the liberals. They may support the progressives. They may support all these weird things. That doesn't mean that's where they're going to land. So what you have to teach your boy is how to understand that other people are going to make different decisions and it's okay. It's not your job to change them. It is your job to accept them and understand that they live a very different life than you do, and you do not have to subscribe to their life just because you're their friend. You can be their friend, but that doesn't mean you have to buy their lifestyle. You know, boys need help feeling supported and feeling that they're not going to be judged. This is a very important. And asking questions and sharing their concerns and saying, here's the most important part, being willing as a father to say, I love you. You can always talk to me. Even when you're upset, you're hurt, or you're confused. Make sure to stay away from language that can discourage them, and be able to allow them to have healthy emotions. This boys don't cry crap. You don't need to be doing that. That does more damage than good. You need to let them have their emotions and learn how to develop an EQ. That's a very important part of moving into life and adjusting into life and having balanced, decent relationships and being able to get a job and being able to network and being able to connect with other people. If you want your kid to be gainfully employed, they need to understand EQ as well as IQ. It's really important to also understand that you as a parent need to walk the talk. Challenge your own perceptions of gender roles and model the behaviors you want to encourage. If you feel that boys really should or shouldn't do a certain thing because they're a boy, ask yourself why. The best way to show your son how to grow up to be a respectful, healthy, connected person is to model qualities yourself and how you relate to others, including a child's other self. Children are finding their way. Boys are finding their way, especially after 10 years old. They're trying to establish their individuality and their independence. You as a parent need to respect that. That means you give them options. You don't tell them what to do. You don't authoritarianly dictate their life. You give them the option to succeed and the option to fail, but you give them options. They need choices. That is a very important thing for a boy to understand, that they have to assess what is the best decision to make rather than you telling them what to do. If you're seeing your son do feminine things, what you want to do is just bring it up and address it. But that is a feminine trait. Doesn't mean it's bad, but you need to understand that if you're going to exhibit that, it's going to be a feminine trait, and that is something that you need to understand is going to come with baggage. It's having those kind of discussions is a very important thing for a boy, especially as they move into their later teenage years. I'm not talking about the early teenage years. I'm talking about the later years, because you want them to explore when they're 10 to about 14. You want them to be able to have some breadth and width of making mistakes and doing crazy things. But the bottom line is you want to guide them into understanding and being more conscious of their behaviors and of their words and of how they act. It's really important to nurture. A sense of self, a degree of numbness and cluelessness and disconnection and mental isolation that we have with so many people. Oh, I grew up in a home where they never showed emotion. You know what? That doesn't mean you have to make your kids do the same thing. You can evolve as a parent. You can learn how to express your emotions. You don't have to just sit in your childhood for your whole life. People are lazy that do that. If you're not communicating connectedness, and if you're communicating isolation, and if you're not getting your kid out there to mix with other people and to be active, you are isolating your kid and you're not going to teach them how to explore in this life and how to be curious and how to learn how to communicate and how to be friends. The problem is that one that is rampant in our culture is boys are raised to ignore their feelings, at least keep them bottled up. But this only prevents them from understanding themselves and connecting with other people in deeper ways. And the cost of disconnection, is high because the disconnection means that they're not going to be surrounded by relationships. They're not going to be able to communicate on a deeper level. They're not going to be able to connect with a female in a great way because females address each other emotionally. That's what boys need to do if they're going to be a part of their lives because women want more respect. They want more attention. They have different needs. And if a boy's not aware of how to do that, he's not going to do a very good job connecting and communicating with her. I'm not saying he needs to mirror her as a female. What I am saying, he needs to learn to identify with her as a female and as a very different person. That takes a little bit of introspection. That takes constant dialogue from a father to a son, from a parent to a son, teaching them how to demonstrate emotions, how to communicate emotions, how to have conflict, how to be respectful. As they grow up, men who adhere to male stereotypes most strongly tend to suffer setbacks. They're also more likely to be depressed, suicidal, and have relationship troubles. So, if you're going to embrace this very traditional, hardcore male image that you want your kid to project, you have to understand that that's an image. You want your kid to become their own person. And that is a hat trick. That is a very hard thing to do, but it's something that you as a parent and as a man have to dig a little deeper. All right, we're going to take another break and we're going to come right back and talk about how to raise a boy to a man. So come back. Welcome back, everybody. All right, we're talking about raising a boy to a man. You know, it sounds weird coming from a man, but you have to nurture boys with love. There is no reason to tear boys away from their mother's arms at a young age to somehow toughen them up. They will move towards autonomy when they are good and ready. And trying to keep love at bay is a mistake. It's very important to understand that kids need loving relationships to help their brains grow. And the warmth and the safety and the security offered from a loving parent is necessary for healthy development, especially as a father to a son. Once again, you have to become a better listener. That means that your son has a different angle, a different view of life than you do. And you have to be willing to allow them to explore what is their view of all kinds of different things. And you don't want to dictate that to them. You want to guide them, you want to help them, you want to keep them from toxicity, but you want them to explore their perspective on life. The pressures to conform to toxic forms of masculinity are very strong for boys, especially in a community like Seattle where the men are women and the women are men. It's a crazy place. It's crazy in these big city cultures where these guys have a very strange image of what is out there and what a man is. It's just extremely weird. I see these masculine women marrying these effeminate men. It's bizarre, and it's just bizarre. But the day and age we're in is that. But that doesn't mean that has to be their example. That just means that's something that we witness as a part of life. But it's very important to understand that emotional expression and being able to be a good listener is called respect. Listening is respect. That is what every human being needs, is to be heard. It's a very important ingredient. Boys need to learn how to do it. Boys need to understand that emotions come with it, and they need to be able to validate those feelings. I understand what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I can imagine you're very upset about this. I could see that this is, addressing emotions is a very important component of connecting at a deeper level. There are mentors out there in your son's life, teachers, coaches, people who truly listen and show up with care and persistent to help boys figure out who they really want to be and follow their own course. When caregivers muster the willingness to simply listen and observe without offering judgments, it makes a world of difference for boys who are trying to develop confidence in their own judgment. So, if they feel like they're always failing you because you're so freaking judgmental, you're not helping them. This judgy crap that you may offer doesn't allow them to evolve into the person that they want to be, and it doesn't, sure as heck, doesn't make you safe. If you're not safe, they're going to lose respect for you, and they're going to divide off parts of themselves that they don't want you to ever see. That means they live a lie. That means they have very little integrity because they can't be themselves with you as their father who expects all these weird behaviors. What you want to understand as a father to a son is you use the word preference, not expectation. I prefer you understood this. I prefer that your behavior was more like this. I prefer you understood that this would affect this person. I prefer that you communicate with me like this. That doesn't mean you expect. It means you prefer. And that allows them to have their own individuality. It's a very important thing, and it's a very important ingredient. It's a very important difference when you're raising a boy. Boys need to feel heard and respected. It might be difficult, not to take anger personally or be hijacked by your own worries. An angry boy can be a very intimidating thing. But you want to guide and understand anger for a boy. Anger for a boy can be a very dangerous thing because many of them end up in anger management classes when they're married, and that's not a good thing. What we want to understand is there's two roots to anger: disrespect, that means you're not being heard, and fear. And it can be disrespect and fear. And if it is, you're probably going to go to rage. But the deal is, if you're going to examine anger in a boy, what you want to understand is how they're feeling disrespected and what they're afraid of. These are the dialogues you have to help your son process the emotion of anger, because you want them to understand how they arrive at it so they can have more tools to be self-disciplined and to control it. Because their job as a boy is to learn how to control their anger, because they can be very powerful, they can be very intimidating, and they can lose a lot of opportunity and a lot of relationships in this life by being angry or have rage. You also want to promote autonomy, not independence. Too often, boys receive the message that their goal for adulthood is independence. It's kind of like the Lone Ranger, where they act alone and in isolation. But what boys really need is autonomy, knowing how to advocate for their own needs, how their values in a relationship to other people, how to build a team around themselves, how to respect other people's talents that they may not have. how to embellish people around them and empower people around them to help empower them. Because the more they empower other people, the more they empower themselves. Providing a net to understand autonomy means that you make choices. And when you make a choice as a boy, you have what's called character. When you don't make choices, you don't have character. It is very hard to love indecisive people in this life. You want your boy to make decisions and to be able to change their mind when the decisions don't happen and don't evolve, don't come through. If the decisions are bad decisions or mildly bad decisions, that's okay. What's more important is you learn from it and you change your mind and you make new choices. The more choices you make as a boy, the more you teach people how to love you. The more support you will get, the more understanding you will get, the more of life will surround you because people know what you want. It's these indecisive boys, the boys who don't understand how to make decisions, that get lost in this life and end up in their parents' basement living off their parents' retirement money. You also want to advocate for boys. It helps parents understand the pressures their boys face while growing into men. Too often, adults suffer from their own preconceived notions of what a boy is or should be, and they fail to see their boy's underlying need for connection. A good place to start is finding ways to see the good in him and remind how he delights you. Understand that you can also educate yourself about boys by reading developmental books, that shine a light on their humanity. Encourage empathy and compassion for how difficult it is just to make it through this life. It's really important to understand that they have to integrate into society, which means they have to learn how to respect other people. That doesn't mean they're going to become other people. If you go to college and you're surrounded by a bunch of transvestites, you need to learn as a boy that you don't have to be a transvestite to be friends with transvestites. That's going to be out there. There's tons of them out there now, and God only knows what they want to do to your boy. But you also want your boy to have boundaries and to understand how to say no and how to understand what they want in their life. You've probably seen a lot of men in your own life who weren't raised right, who grew up to be lonely, isolated adults. These are men who will never have a wife or may just be too inept to function as adults. But that's never going to stop them from breeding, believe me. You do not want your boy to turn into one of these creatures, one of these weird, angry creatures that live off their parents until they're 40 years old, that don't know how to have a job, don't know how to be responsible, can't stand for somebody to tell them what to do, can't be a part of a team, live as victims. That is not masculine traits. That is a worthless piece of crap. And if you want to raise that, you're more than welcome to do that because all you have to do is nothing like their parents did. What you want to do is teach them a model of what healthy is, but that doesn't mean they're going to be healthy. There's behaviors that you want your parents to understand that you as a parent do not want these behaviors. You want to confront them. If you have a child that berates you, that does expects you to clean up after them, that tells you that's a woman's work or that's somebody else's, you have a serious problem on your hand and you got to address it because the problem starts with you. You know, we all know you want your son to succeed, but pushing things out of the way will not give him the strength of character to make it through this life. If you're going to do everything for your sons, if you're going to cook for them, if you're going to be insulted by them, if you're going to be berated by them, if you're going to drive them everywhere, if you're going to hover over them your whole life, if you're going to follow them everywhere they go, if you're going to be tracking them on your phone, you are a pathetic piece of crap because you're going to raise a nasty, egotistical little turd that is going to have a really hard time becoming a man in this life. So what you want to think about is boundaries and behavior contracts. Behavior contracts are great things for boys. Why? Because the boy is in charge of his own discipline. So It works like this. If you're going to talk back to me, if you're going to berate me, I'm going to count to three. And if I get to three, you're going to lose your phone for a day. If you apologize after you've done that, I will give it back to you for half a day. Now, if you do it again, you're going to lose it for 3 days and there's no apology. And you do it again, it's going to be 7 days and there's no apology. That's the contract. Now, if they keep doing things, and you can list about three or four things that you are trying to extinguish or bring forward and make it better, you want to add other commodities to the deal. Maybe it's their bedroom door, taking it off. The thing is, you have to look at what your kid really wants and use that as a commodity to guide them. But the other thing about a behavior contract is if you go 5 days without doing any of this bad stuff, here's the reward. You can spend another hour on your video game or whatever. You can go to your friend's house. It doesn't have to cost you money, but what it is, it's a reward that they earn. They need to learn about what's called a token economy. That means that they get paid for certain behaviors. They get rewards for behaviors and they get punishments for other behaviors. Another thing that is not a good thing to do for your son is to tell them they need to get a job or get a girlfriend. What you have to do is have an exploratory idea of what your son wants so that you can help him make better choices. But you're not going to sit there guilt and shaming him over not getting a job or a girlfriend. That is not going to build their self-esteem. Building their self-esteem means you care about them, you ask questions, you integrate into their lives. Giving empty praise is terrible. This dynamic is a key sign that you may be raising a child to become a narcissist. Praising them for wiping their ass and doing stupid things is not a good idea. You want to praise them for doing hard things. Raising children without parental warmth can lead to a range of negative consequences. Low self-esteem, difficulty regulating emotions, struggle with social relationships, anxiety, depression, higher risk of developing mental health issues later in life. But the deal is, you don't want to sit around praising them for stupidity. You want to praise them for hard work. That is the differentiator. The other thing is mama's boys, raising boys with emotional support for you. There are a lot of narcissistic, crazy women that will use their son as their little emotional support system, their little teddy bear. That's not a good idea. That's not a good way to raise your son. You need to allow your son's feelings to be the most important thing, not your stupid emotions. You have friends for that. You're an adult. Go make friends with someone else or go get a therapist, but don't use your son as a way to coddle your stupid emotions. Your emotions are yours. They're not theirs. They're not fully developed, and you're not doing your son any favor by turning them into this codependent thing that has to listen and feel for you. So much damage happens to boys who lose their manhood from a mother who used them as emotional codpiece for themselves. Exposing them to dysfunction or abuse. Your kids are going to act like their parents. And if they're witnessing people that are violent or disrespectful to each other, that's what they're going to be when they're married. You are their role model. Your job to your spouse, if you're married, is to cherish your wife and to respect your husband. So what is respect? That means you know what to buy them when you go to the grocery store. It doesn't mean you agree with them. You just understand them. You understand and you care about what they have to say. You care about what they feel. That's called respect. What is a woman? Cherish. She needs to be cherished. And a boy needs to learn this. So what is cherish? Can't be the man I am without her. Don't know why she's with me. Lucky to have her. She's my best friend. I'm so proud to talk about her when I'm with her and when I'm not with her. That's what a woman needs. Boys need to understand that. If they don't learn how to cherish, they're going to have a hell of a time being married. And I'm not talking about cherishing your golf game or your best friends. I'm talking about a woman you are married to. That is what you owe them if you're going to get married. You know, it's really important to understand that boys need to roughhouse, they need competition, they need risk. These are factors that you naturally have to guide a child into in a safe way. But you don't want them going through life as competition being the main driver. You want their helping other people to be their main driver. You know, it is so important to understand that what you are sought for in this life is more important and should be the motivator. What people seek you for that you have taken the time to learn. That is the most important thing that a boy needs to understand. All right, that's as far as I can go. That's our show. I want to thank you for listening. I love hearing from you. You can do that on our webpage, voiceamericamedia.com, or libsyn, libsyn.com, Dr. Gary Bell's Absurd Psychology. Now remember, how many roads does a man need to walk down before he admits he's lost? Also, this generation of men makes being celibate easy for women. Also, we're in a day and age where male bashing is funny and female bashing is sexy.